Hey folks, welcome to another episode of ASP.NET Core from Zero to Overkill. This will be the first of 5 episodes, I guess, at least for now, regarding Identity Server and integrating IdentityServer4 with our application, with what we developed so far. So, in the previous episodes, we have been implementing some components independently. So we developed the group management service. We then created a single page application to be our front end. We created an authentication service. And then we created also a backend for front end to be the bridge between the front end application and all the services we will be developing. Starting with this episode, like I said, it will be more than one. We'll start to get everything working together. So far, they have been working independently, but now we want everything to start working together. In this episode and in the following, in this probably we won't see code even, but in the following episodes, we will of course see code, but it won't be live coding as in previous episodes. The topic is a bit more complex, and I don't want another bunch of 2-hour videos like the authentication episodes. So this time I wrote the code already, and we'll take a look at everything. And if there are questions, as always, feel free to drop them in the comments or in the other means of contact that I provide. So as for what we are going to do, we are going to integrate IdentityServer, so the authentication service will use IdentityServer, and the other services will interact with it. It will be like generic. It doesn't it's not really related to IdentityServer. IdentityServer provides us a way to implement an OpenId connect and a Auth2 identity provider. So all the authentication service will be using IdentityServer. The rest is independent. It would work with all other ways. We could use Google Authentication, Facebook, Twitter, or something like Azure AD or Auth0, which provides these kinds of services. So using IdentityServer is really a way to have things very customizable. If we don't need to really do that, it's probably easier to go with a solution, a cloud-hosted solution that just handles that for us. But in this case, as we are learning, we want to check out IdentityServer. Specifically in this episode of these 5 episodes, we'll see an overview of the application architecture so far and how we'll put it all working together. We'll see how the authentication flow will work, and we'll take a look at the OpenID Connect flow that will be used, because we have various options, and I chose one for this case, but there are other options. I'll just take a look at the option I took, but remember, there are others and maybe better for your situation or not. So the usual plugs. If these videos are being helpful, please consider liking them, sharing, and leaving feedback so we can improve and reach more people. And let's go. This time it ain't coding, but let's go. So the overall architecture will be something like this. So we don't have exactly this yet in development, but the idea in production, or when we get Docker, which will be soon, hopefully, the idea will be something like this. So the user, which will interact with the single page application, will go through a reverse proxy. So like a reverse proxy, load balancer, whatever, will be what sticks between the browser and the services. So the first thing that will be the single page application. So the first request to our application will give the user the single page, so it renders in the browser. Then when in the browser the requests that are made by the single page application go through the back for front end, which will be responsible for going to group management. But before going to that API, we'll need to be authenticated. So when we log in, we will be redirected to the auth service. So all of these services will be, of course, in the server, and the reverse proxy will handle the requests going to the specific places. So for instance, to see the difference between the single page application and the back for front will be like the /API, like we saw in the configuration of the view application in dev environment. And for the auth service, we'll probably use a different domain name, a different host name. So when we'll set up probably in the hosts file that to go to this place, and then the reverse proxy will take care of forwarding the requests to the correct service. So I've put some numbers here. So number one, like I was saying, the request to get to the single page application static file. So nothing special here. It's just to get the static files. And number two will be mostly API requests made by the single page application. These requests will be authenticated using cookies. So we authenticate the browser and the back for front using cookies. We'll also use, like we saw in regards to MVC and Razor pages, there will be a cross-site request forgery token to protect for these kinds of attacks. In this case will be a little different because we are using a single page application, but the idea is the same. We'll see how this is implemented. And then there will be authentication needed. So during this time, the auth service communicates directly with the browser, and it will use some OpenID Connect front channel redirects and stuff like that. So we are going to the back for front, which will redirect to the auth service that will allow us to authenticate, use the consent page to see if we consent. In this case, I have it active just as an example, but I will put it inactive because this authentication service is not generic like a Google authentication. It's just specific to this app, so it makes no sense to have the consent. But just so we are checking out all of this infrastructure, I used the consent page just for example. And in case of 4, there will be the API requests made by the back for front to the group management API will be authenticated with an access token that is obtained by the back for front from the authentication service. Will be a JWT token, but could also be a reference token. We can talk about it in a future episode. So requests from the user to the back for front will use a cookie, but then when the back for front, by using that cookie, can obtain the token that we'll use to access this API and eventually other APIs. So, and in 5, this number 5 will be requests, back channel requests after the authentication is done, and it's by means of those redirects I mentioned over here. So the user goes here, is redirected here, and does all the authentication needs. But then things like getting user info will be done through the back channel. So the back for front will go to the authentication service and ask for info regarding the user that with the token, and obtain a refresh token also through this directly. Doesn't need to go to the front end anymore. So we can make requests directly. Okay, so I made a little diagram regarding the flow that will happen when we want to authenticate. So when we want to authenticate or starting the application, we get the single page application, which will have limited functionality because we don't have we are not authenticated yet. So then the user can click login, and the back for front will redirect the user to the authentication service, the authorized endpoint, which is known in the it's part of the OpenID Connect, and the redirect to this authorized endpoint includes the client ID, the scopes that the client requires. Scopes are like the things that the client will be able to access using that authentication. For instance, in this case, we'll want to get access to some user information and be able to do requests to the group management API. So these are a couple of scopes that will be needed. When we are redirected here, so we get to the authentication service, and the usual login process will go on. So that pages that we have seen in the past, we'll see them. So we can log in, and then a screen with a consent screen will appear, so we can authorize or not the access to that information. Like I said, this is just for example because it makes no sense in this case. So that's why I put here this line between the browser and the authentication service. So it will happen the usual process, and the backend for front end in that case is just waiting for information to come back. So when the login process is done, the authentication service redirects the user back to the back for front. That redirect will include an authorization code. I forgot to mention, but we are going to use the OpenID Connect code flow. There are others. This one works well, and because we are doing everything on the back end, works nicely. If we were doing everything in the front end or like in a mobile application, we wouldn't use this flow because we wouldn't have a secure place to keep a user's client secret. But because we are doing everything on the back end, we can keep the client secret secure there. So when the login process is done, the authentication redirects back to back for front, and with an authorization code, and then on the back end for front end, in this case it's not the browser that goes directly, it's the back end for front end, which grabs that code, and with its credentials, the client ID, client secret, whatever, it can ask directly to the authentication service, give me an access token for this user, and then the authentication service can provide that information. With the new token, the BFF can now make requests on behalf of the user. In this case, we'll use that to go to the authentication service and ask for the user info. This could already be present in the token, but instead of having like a large token, we can just have a small token and grab the information later. So, and then we get the user info. It can be stored on a cookie, on the cache, whatever. After storing with this, the back for front will store what it needs in cookies, So the browser then can be authenticated with the backend for frontend. And we'll finally return the control to the frontend, which in the next requests is already authenticated and can make the request. So right now we have everything we need, and the frontend can make an API request, for instance, to list the groups of the user. It's authenticating using the cookie, and then the BFF can make requests using a JWT to the group management API that will check if the JWT is valid and use that to authenticate the user, and now can make things in the name of the user. Right now our groups are just gets all the groups that exist, but of course we'll eventually change that so each user has its own groups and this information makes more sense. So before wrapping up this episode, which was just to give this overview of what's going on, just a couple of references. So for much more information on OpenID Connect and all that flow, I strongly advise going to these docs or checking out other examples, because I won't be going into much more detail. IdentityServer abstracts a lot of this away, but it's still important to know what's going on, and because we need to configure IdentityServer, it's useful to know what we are configuring. So for instance, over here in authentication we can check the flows that I was talking about. We are using the authorization code flow. There are others, implicit flow, I guess it's the more used when in like mobile application, for instance, I think. Hybrid flow, I am not really sure what's going on in here. But like I said, we are using authorization code flow because we have a backend, so we can do everything in there. So yeah, lots of important info over here. Regarding IdentityServer, of course, there are a lot of docs explaining mostly everything, and with examples and quick start applications that we can use. For instance, we can go to GitHub and we have a lot of samples, quick start UI, so we have like the authorization and authentication part out of the box. We already built our own, just we'll add IdentityServer to it, but if not, we could use this quick start. And finally, we might as well see the application running. In the next episodes we will see how this is working, but remember the awesome application we created. So we don't see here the groups information because we are not authenticated, so we must log in. We were redirected to the authentication service, so I'm using this one. Need this, but this is the consent screen. Basically adapted from what they have in the samples, but they are using MVC, and since we are building our authentication service with the Razor pages, I made a quick adaptation. It's not perfect by any means, but it works just for the example. But like I mentioned earlier, I will be removing this screen because it doesn't make sense, since this authentication service is just for the scope of this application, not generic. So if the application asks for permissions, we will grant them because they are all related applications and not third party. For a third party, probably this would need, but this case, the client that is the client that is the single page application and the back for front doesn't need this. So consent, we say allow, and this will redirect back, and we are back here, and instead of login now we have groups, and we have the cookie without authenticating us. So if we go to groups, this should appear something. This is hideous because I haven't got around to make this pretty, but it serves the purpose of showing what's going on. So you've seen the flow is the same as we see in the other applications. Our identity provider instead of Google or Twitter is our auth service, and yeah. So that's about it. I think I have no more slides. So in the next episode we'll start seeing the code to make this happen. This was just an overview one, and I hope these 5 episodes are not that long, because it's not really useful to be dragging this around. And as always, any question, please make sure to drop them in the comments or Twitter or the blog or whatever. Hope to see you in the next one. See yous!